Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. We are talking about, I have a slide, collaborating across the stack with GitHub and GraphQL. But before we get started, I should let you know a little bit about myself. My name is Adam. I work at Apollo. If you know about GraphQL, you might know about Apollo too. Don't worry if you don't know about GraphQL. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And what I do at Apollo is cloud systems engineering, cloud engineering, data engineering, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't matter. The reason I want to tell you that is for two reasons. One is I collaborate on APIs all the time. I'm working with front-end developers and back-end developers around what changes we're going to make to our API, what data we need in our integrations and in our app. And the second reason is I want you to think carefully about the designs I have. And remember that I'm a cloud engineer in my slides. So when you look at those, just keep that in mind. So what we do at Apollo is essentially all around GraphQL. And we've been working with GraphQL since it was launched in 2015. We work with lots of different customers around GraphQL. One of them is Airbnb, and I threw this quote up there so you can see what it means to them. But hopefully, it means a different thing to you guys out in the crowd. And at Apollo, we want to build the GraphQL platform, a whole solution for it. And before I dive into what that means, with a show of hands, how many of you guys have heard of GraphQL? Awesome. That's great. And how many of you guys have used, touched, tinkered with GraphQL? Wow. That is tremendous. And how many of you guys are using GraphQL in production? OK. Still a good number. And that's huge because, because in 2015, just a few short years ago, GraphQL was originally launched at React Europe and originally introduced before that at ReactConf. And there was no tooling around it other than a reference implementation until 2016 when Apollo Client was born, one of the first tools to work with GraphQL. And of course, the namesake of Apollo and how we got started. And this is only in the last year. GraphQL is still growing. And even though so many of you out in the audience know about GraphQL and have heard of it or tinkered with it, there's still a lot of people who haven't. And so this is huge that it's gone so far in the last 3 years. It's a really pivotal technology. Every year we have an annual GraphQL summit to talk about what's happening in GraphQL. And the very first GraphQL summit we had was in 2016, less than a year after it's launch. And already there were early adopters using it. GitHub had released or was working on the very first public GraphQL API. Shopify and Coursera were using it, and Facebook, of course, had originally led the charge on GraphQL and invented it. And now we're standing today with tons of different companies using GraphQL, whether they're using it in production for their internal developer tools, or they have engineers tinkering with it. A lot of more people have heard about GraphQL, and we're going to talk a little bit about what kind of opportunities GraphQL provides, specifically for collaboration. But in order to motivate that, I'm just going to click this thing. In order to motivate that, there are a couple of things that I had in mind. And when dealing with this, one of the first things was around API development and collaborating on APIs, because GraphQL is just a language for talking about data. And I could have been talking universally about collaborating on data or collaborating on APIs. And that's something that I was thinking a lot when I was building this talk. And I want to talk first about a motivation for GraphQL, why we need a universal language for data, what's important about it. Then I want to touch a little bit on what our mission is at Apollo. And then I want to take a step back from GraphQL and from Apollo and think about just collaboration in general, taking specific motivation from GitHub, which is why we're here today, to celebrate GitHub and the motivations that we've gleaned from it and the work that we've been able to do around it. And lastly, I want to talk about the actual topic, which is collaborating with GraphQL. So the first thing is the why and what of GraphQL. And the reason is very simple. I alluded to it a little bit earlier, and it's data. So this is actually, this is GitHub's data model, all of GitHub's data model. So as you guys might know, GitHub has a public GraphQL API, and there's a tool called GraphQL Voyager you can use to visualize all of the data in a company. And you can see this isn't even the entire data model. There are tendrils expanding out to the side of more information that GitHub exposes just in their public API. And the point of this slide is to show you that no one person or one team, or sometimes even a collection of teams, can understand and keep in mind the model of data for their whole company. So you need to have some kind of organization. And how a lot of people do that is docs, just tons and tons of docs. I'm sure you guys have worked with docs around REST APIs before. Sometimes they're great, sometimes they're not. But all the time, they require a lot of work from developers to keep up to date and to organize the data that we have, to make it discoverable for users of that API or future collaborators with us building up the next versions. And it's incredibly hard to keep up with that. But at least it's a way to talk about data in a universal way, which is English. But I think that we could have an even more universal way to talk about data. And this isn't an old concept. This isn't a new concept. This is a very old concept called a lingua franca. Who here has heard of what a lingua franca is? Sure. So for those of you who haven't, it is a language that you can systematically use to talk with someone else who might not speak the same language you do. This is a really common term in business. When you have people from different countries, from different continents, from different cultures and backgrounds, who have a language that they can use to negotiate, to trade, to make deals. And I think that we can have the same thing for data. We can have a lingua franca for data, and I think that's what GraphQL is. And it serves a really vital point of, in our infrastructure, where you have your application code and your application team that needs certain data so that they can expose it to your end user, whoever that might be. Then you have your services and your databases and all that underlying technology that has some capability of giving you data, giving you information. And GraphQL is that vital layer in between that maps those requirements to those capabilities. It's a language to map those two together and to talk about data. And to give you a really brief peek at what that language is, I know a lot of you guys said that you've touched it or you're familiar with it, but it's two things. It's first, on the left-hand side, you have the type system. GraphQL is a strongly typed language. And this is exposing what the capabilities are, what language is available, and you can explore it however you see fit. You can understand it and evolve as you go. And on the right-hand side, you have the requirements, asking for data, and traversing the graph exposed by the capabilities. This offers two things. It offers specificity, which is really important on your client-side code, and it also offers flexibility, which is really important from both ends, because you can build up and expand your GraphQL API any way that you see fit, which is not something that you can easily accomplish with other frameworks. But hold on. I feel like we've heard this before. We've heard this mantra of, I have this thing for you. It's amazing. It's going to standardize everything that you want. Amazing. But this is exactly what happens. And I'm sure you guys, some of you guys have seen this XKCD comic before. There are 14 standards for collaborating on REST APIs, and here are all of them, and it's terrible. We really need one to unify all of them. So we make a 15th standard. But I think that GraphQL is different. I really do. And the reason I think it's different is that developers actually like using it. And I don't know if this is going to work, but make some noise if you like using GraphQL out there. Yeah. And I love using it. And just to give you kind of a quick peek of what it is to use GraphQL, if I can get this to work, this is a video of using the GitHub GraphQL API. And you can go to that link I have at the bottom to use GitHub's GraphQL API immediately. Just sign in, you get your tokens, you can run queries. You see that the data comes back in exactly the same shape that you asked for it in. And you can, as you write your query and try to explore the data that you need, for whatever it might be, whether it's your UI or a Slack bot, you can start getting autocomplete and awareness of what it is that you're building and what data is available to you. Now, I'm not going to go too much deeper into what GraphQL is, but I will say that there is an awesome book if you guys aren't familiar with it or want to learn more about the nuts and bolts of how to spin up a GraphQL server and consume client code and merge schemas together. This book I have right in front of me is really tremendous at getting started, and I have a whole bunch of copies, so come find me after the talk, and I'm happy to give them away as while supplies last. On the other hand, if you're more of an online learner, here are a whole bunch of links that you could take a photo of, or I'll tweet out at the end, of tons of community resources to get started with GraphQL. But the next thing that I want to talk about is what the future of GraphQL is, what GraphQL enables. In order to talk about that, I really have to take note of the community around GraphQL, because that is what enables its power. And also to talk about what our mission is as Apollo. And it's to bring GraphQL everywhere, to enable an open source community and a community of companies all across the world who can use GraphQL to better their needs, to make things more universal, and to collaborate better. And even though we just started with Apollo Client, we have something like 170 different repositories around GraphQL. And these are 4 of the main ones to get started. A client, all of this is in TypeScript or JavaScript. Client, a server, a React integration for particular users of React, though we have others as well, and tools to make modifications of schemas and to mock schemas, and to work with your API contracts in unique ways. But if you're not a TypeScript programmer, JavaScript programmer, and you like Java or Rust or Kotlin or Lua, there is a huge community around GraphQL. GraphQL is opinionated about one thing and one thing only, and that's data. It is how to talk about data. Where that data is stored, what languages you use to talk about that data when you're consuming it or fetching it don't matter, as long as you're using GraphQL in between. And we also work on having some of those building some community resources ourselves to help people get started and to learn about how to use our tools, along with those other resources that I posted before. And what we're building is the GraphQL platform. This is kind of a selfish segment now, because I get to tell you about what I specifically work on. To give you a little bit more insight into what I do and how I think about GraphQL and how I think about data. And it's also selfish because I get to feature my dog. And the reason that I'm featuring her is because I think that GraphQL opens doors that haven't been opened before. And here's an example of Lucy opening a door. Real cute. OK. And one of the first doors that we saw GraphQL open is the idea of tracing. Since you're specifically making a traversal down your data graph, and you're asking for exactly what you need, you can see at each step, at each edge you traverse along that graph, how long that's taking, how much load it's putting on your UI, on your server code, as well as what errors you might encounter along the way, and dig specifically into each one of those individual fields and edges. And this is something that we as developers have had to rebuild over and over again as we expose more APIs, but not something that you need to rebuild with GraphQL. So it's one of the first things we built, to build up this tracing and to build up statistical awareness of your tracing over time for lots of different GraphQL servers, and generically over all of GraphQL. But the next thing we thought about was integrations. Taking all of that information that we had around your server execution and bringing it wherever you are. So if you want to use Datadog for your metrics, if you want to use PagerDuty for your alerts, if you want to use Slack for your collaboration, all this information should be there to help you make better decisions and faster decisions around your workflow. That information should be in your IDE directly, so that when you're writing queries to get your data, or when you're modifying your schema to expose new data, you have an understanding of what you're working with without having to go back and forth between different tools. There are also universal things that we still need to rebuild over and over again for non-standard things, like caching and like errors, and we work a lot on that. So that's kind of the state of the world of what we do as Apollo today. We have this whole set of open source tools, and we work a lot on what we can do to open the doors of GraphQL and the doors of API development that you don't need to redo over and over and over again. But I think an important thing that hasn't yet been unlocked, though it's been talked about a lot, is having GraphQL as a place for collaboration on your APIs. But don't take it from me. Let's actually talk about collaboration here, because we're at a GitHub conference, and GitHub does collaboration really, really well. So what makes GitHub so successful at code collaboration and at collaboration in general? I think it's a few key things. And I want to learn from GitHub here, and I'll try to apply those learnings back to GraphQL. The first thing is centrality. The idea that we can bridge the gap between your code and your software, because you might work on code in a ton of different places. You might work in different local IDEs with different build processes, even in different languages. And you might ship your software to different places. You might have on-premises solutions. You might have a whole Docker fleet that you run on your own. You might ship it to the cloud using Kubernetes. You might be in Azure. You might have Lambda functions, whatever it might be. There needs to be something to bridge the gap between the two and to make sure that when you communicate with the other people on your team working on this, you have a language to speak. And that language is GitHub. So it's central to those two themes. You're trying to get from code to software, and GitHub is in the middle, allowing you to work together on it. So I think that's important. So the first thing is centrality. But the second thing is universality. Because as we learned with the XKCD slide from earlier, if you have tons of different solutions for doing this, you're going to have to relearn frameworks over and over. And you're going to have to redo things in all these different places, which is not ideal. You want a place to have all of your code and all of your software in one place. And that is exactly what GitHub enables by having this great system around different repositories and people and teams and projects. And even though we started with just the one Apollo project, Apollo client, as I said, we're now at 173 different repositories all across the Apollo workspace. So it's really been key to have all of that in one place so we can build up our community around it and all work together more effectively. But the third thing is languages. You need a language to communicate. That's important, right? If you don't have a way to talk to each other about what you're working on, then you're not going to get anything done. And GitHub has built support for tons of different languages. This is the repo that I specifically work on, and we work in a lot of different languages, and GitHub supports them all. There's the right syntax highlighting, the right understanding, the right insights about security analyses. So that's something that I think GitHub has gotten really right, is these three concepts: centrality, universality, and languages. So let's think through those three with GraphQL. So the first is centrality, right? You saw this slide before. GraphQL is an automatic mapping between your requirements and your capabilities, or in our terms, your client code and your server code. So it's central. It's right there in the middle. Cool, check. The next thing is universality. Having all of your data in one place. We're talking about collaborating on APIs. We're talking about collaborating on data. And so you need to have all of that data in one place to be able to work on it. And so when you're talking about other frameworks like REST, you might have that data scattered across multiple different endpoints that have different requirements, that have different schemas, that have different implementers and different teams working on them with different styles. But with GraphQL, you just have one. It's your GraphQL endpoint that has a universal way of talking about that data with its language. So cool, universality. Feeling good so far. The next one is language, and language is really easy because GraphQL, the L stands for language. We have a language out of the box. So I think we have our three. We have centrality. Your GraphQL layer is what is, just as GitHub is mapping from your code to your software, GraphQL is mapping from your server to your client, from your capabilities to your requirements, and so on and so forth. And it is, in fact, a language in and of itself, which enables collaboration. All right, all of our checks passed. You know what that means? It's time to ship GraphQL collaboration. But the next thing is, it's not just that you can collaborate, it's how to collaborate. And one of the amazing things that GitHub also does is building up workflows to collaboration. And we've seen an extent of this even going much farther beyond in today's talks and yesterday's talks around the new actions feature and around making suggestions, which I think are really pivotal and will drive the future of being able to collaborate and build up better workflows together so that we can do things more automatically. And I think we can build up those same workflows around GraphQL. So let's look at my idea of a very simplified GitHub workflow. So you start off and you ask for some changes. Like, I don't like this code. I want new code. Please give me more code. And then the implementer goes ahead and says, you have a conversation. You're like, well, actually, I think that that's a good idea, but maybe parts X and Y shouldn't be done, and parts A, B, and C should. You go on and you have a conversation around the requests, and eventually you agree on what you're going to build. You go ahead and you start building it. You branch off, create a pull request, and you have that same conversation around, did this actually meet the needs that you were asking for? Can you work with it? And then you go through that checks process that we just did with enabling collaboration in the first place. There's an approval process. There's CI and CD workflows before you actually ship that software to its end destination. So let's leverage this idea of the GitHub workflow for GraphQL. So collaborating on GraphQL, the whole point. So let's take that first step, collaborating together by first asking for a change. That's the first step. Well, this is simple. Let's just ask for a modification of the API. We need different data. And this isn't just about the API. We're talking about GraphQL. So let's be specific. We're requesting a modification to the GraphQL schema, the contract that says, these are the capabilities I have of giving you data so that you can get it. But who should be asking for that? It's, at the end of the day, whomever is going to consume that data and do something with it. So I really love this. The other day, our own Chung, who astute listeners and viewers out in the crowd will notice is also the creator of the NPM charts from before, asked our team for new data to be exposed in our GraphQL schema. And I really love the way that he did it. And I think this is like a de facto standard for GraphQL. You write a query that you want to be able to execute. You know, in the schema, I want to be able to see a hash and a created at. And not only that, I also want to understand when that schema was last changed and get that supplementary information. And maybe some of this data exists, and maybe some of it doesn't. And then also providing the supplemental materials of what are you going to do with that data? How are you going to surface that to the end user? Why do you need it? Do you actually need it? Maybe you can use something else that we already have. So essentially, your front-end developer says, I has query, and asks, can I has a schema? And it's on the schema implementers and those who expose the capabilities to provide that schema and to work together. So you go through that process of seeing that modification that's been requested and working together to figure out what it is that they really need. And then you can actually start implementing the resolvers. And this is something that we all know. We know implementation, how to collaborate on it, because that's GitHub. So you go ahead and you start implementing the same way that you collaborate on code by pointing to that original issue, saying, OK, now I'm implementing this schema modification. Here's how I'm doing it. You work on the code in whatever language you might choose with GraphQL and with pull requests. But the bonus here is that while you're implementing those new features, clients can actually work against a mocked out schema, which is really cool. And I didn't even know this because, as I mentioned, I'm more on the cloud side of things and implementing the schema. But it's literally like 7 lines of code to just mock out a whole schema, which I think is remarkable. And a huge benefit of GraphQL, because it unblocks that burden of waiting on your backend developers to make changes to the API so that you can start writing the modifications you need for your user code. And then the last step is actually testing your schema changes against current clients. You want to make sure that the changes that you're making, they were really good for that one person who asked for them, and hopefully you thought about the rest of the world. But let's also make sure that they work for everyone else who's using your API. This is a big difference between GraphQL and other frameworks, because you can feel much safer modifying your API because you know exactly how it's used. You have that specificity where if clients want to understand, want to get some data, they have to specifically ask for it. It's not just given to them in giant vomits of information. So you can see how your current clients are using your API. And this is something that we've built and we've been working with internally for a while, and we're really happy with. And the reason that this was motivated is because of those partners that we mentioned. Partners at huge organizations like GitHub and like Airbnb, who have lots of different software engineering teams and lots of different moving parts, but want a universal place for their data and to be able to see how they're modifying their schema over time and feeling safe about doing it. So you can make changes to your schema and change types and fields and have that history that you can understand what changes have been made when and by whom. And you can dig into a specific element of history to see how safe it was. If it's a warning, maybe no one is using it yet, but it is in fact a breaking change. If it's a failure, maybe you're breaking a client that's running in production. And if it's a notice, maybe it's completely innocuous. You've added a field, for instance. And one thing that we do internally and that I really love, because I'm constantly iterating on this schema, is building it directly into the Git workflow using the GitHub Checks API. And this is something that you can get out of the box if you are using a GraphQL schema. By establishing that history over time, you can then register it, look through the changes that you have, and bring observability as well into the decisions that you're making around whether or not it's safe to make a schema change. And as I mentioned, what I work on a lot is observability. So what's really exciting to me is to be able to see that kind of come together within our own data graph of bringing together your schema versioning and history over time with the observability that you can have into how your GraphQL server and clients are working in production. So being able to annotate each history, each element of history in each version with clients that you might be breaking or queries that might be run against it is really exciting to me. And I think the future of this is having more of a tie-in between the code and the software that you're writing and the API that you're developing and the data you're exposing. So essentially, bringing GitHub more front and center and the collaboration that you already have built into how you work on code into how you work on schemas. There's already a little bit of that there if you look in the upper right here around having commit messages. But I think that we can go much further. And as you're making schema changes, to see exactly where the schema changes you're making come from, what lines of code in whatever language they are and whatever repo they are, made by whichever team member they might be. And at the same time, being able to go from the very beginning of that process, when you want to suggest a change and write a query that you can't see anymore, and going to where that code lives in whatever repo or set of repos it might be that expose that API. And so now, hopefully, I will do a short demo for you guys. If I can get out of here. So the other week, I was like, I wonder what would happen if I just register GitHub's API for our service. And as you know, GitHub has a public GraphQL API. And this was super easy. With GraphQL, you can make an introspection request to their server. And I kind of forgot about this. On October 3rd, I published the schema as it was. And then the other day, I guess October 11th, 6 days ago, I published a new version. I was really surprised and delighted to see that GitHub had already made modifications to their schema in those past 8 days. And you're able to see the actual changelog of those informations. What types were removed or added or changed. You could also see deprecations. So if you're a client collaborating with this, what? Oh. My bad. OK, hold on. Thank you for telling me. This is going to make it much harder to do the demo, but that's OK. So I was really excited to see that they had actually made modifications to their schema, and you could see the changelog over that time. That there was, of course, I don't have any observability into the metrics of how people are using GraphQL schema, but I am able to see that there was one failure, an entire type was removed, and if someone was relying on that, then they're probably in a sad state right now. Then there was also a set of types that were deprecated and things that were added, probably specifically for this conference today. And the demo that I want to do is uploading a new schema and seeing if there are any new changes in the past 6 days. So I will move it over this time. Or try to. What? Yeah. I'm really good at computers. So the other day, and by the other day I actually mean a few minutes ago, I made an introspection schema against GitHub and downloaded it to a file. And the reason I did that is because you need to have authentication tokens, and I didn't really want to show you guys mine. But trust that in intro.json, not old intro.json, is GitHub's current, as of an hour ago, GraphQL schema. And you can run a check against that schema pointing to a local service. In this case, I'm pointing to that service we were just looking at in the UI to see if there are any modifications before you publish so that you can feel safe publishing that new version. So let's see what the check gives us. OK, cool. So there were fields added. And they're just notices, because it's not breaking anything. So we should feel safe publishing this. And it looks like 2 things were added. Now you can do a pull request review on behalf of someone else. And you can also mark a pull request review comment as outdated. Cool. These are awesome features. So let's go ahead and change that check command to hopefully publish, if I remember correctly. And cool. We have a new tag and a new schema. And let's see if it shows up. Yep, it's right there. And as you see, we have 2 notices that these 2 fields were added. Soon you should be able to go back and look at the actual commits that were made in GitHub if you have that flexibility. Of course, we don't here because I was not the one who made those changes to the GitHub GraphQL API. And look and see specifically how they were made, by whom, and for what reasons. The whole conversations and collaborations around the code and around the request, which is really exciting. Now, back to not demo. So from here on, that is what I wanted to share. I wanted to share the vision that I see for collaborating on GraphQL, what is already out there and what you can do with it, and whether or not you're using GraphQL right now, hopefully you understand and you see the same value that I see in using GraphQL to work more effectively on our data layer, on our APIs, and be able to grow them and expand them and use them more flexibly. And we'd love for you guys to connect with us. We would love to collaborate on open source. You can go to the Apollo GraphQL community in GitHub. We offer support and training. We would love to partner with you. If you have cool ideas around projects, you should definitely join our Apollo Slack. We have a public Slack that you can use. You can find me on there with the name that I'll show later on. And we're also hiring. So if this is really exciting stuff to you and you want to work on the future of GraphQL, check out our careers page, see what's interesting to you, or message me directly. This is my information here. My Slack is also Zionts. You can find me on there, same as my GitHub. Twitter handle is _Zionts. So if you know anyone who has that Zionts handle, let me know. I'll negotiate. And feel free to email me too. Again, I'm going to have some resources afterwards, not only these books here, but also T-shirts and stickers, so come find me. I'd love to talk more if you have thoughts about GraphQL and collaboration. And lastly, final pub of GraphQL Summit, which is just in a few weeks. And as I mentioned before, there's limited availability on these. I was only able to get 5, but these are first come, first serve, 5 tickets to get $200 off individual tickets with code GitHub GraphQL when you want to come to GraphQL Summit. It's November 6th to 8th in San Francisco. We'd love to have you there. We're going to talk a lot more about all of this stuff. So cool. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.